All right, so one character I've always kind of been interested in, but I think probably like a lot of casual audiences, I have never really been able to engage in the comics. You know, it's not, the comics for whatever reason have never been as big as the standing image of Stallone as Judge Dredd, which is kind of deters people. My familiarity with Judge Dredd begins with the Stallone movie from '95, which I think is a pretty regrettable incident. There's been some criticism over the helmet thing. We'll get more into that later. So then they followed up in, let's see, 2012. I mean, well, not as a follow-up, kind of as a another attempt at the character. You had Carl Urban playing Dredd in the movie titled Dredd, and that was actually very well received by critics. In fact, it's probably one of the best received action movies of all time, and probably one of the best received comic movies of all time. So that being my experience with Judge Dredd, and of course, you know, I think there's kind of a darker comics connection there. I mean, you know, you kind of see a lot of people put him side by side with somebody like the Punisher, just because we're talking about kind of in Judge Dredd, he's not so self-appointed. I mean, he's got the backing of the government to do what he does, but in that same sense of going out there and kind of relentlessly taking control, I mean, we're talking very similar characters, I think, in the same ballpark anyway.
They are in the same ballpark, but they're very different characters within the ballpark. Punisher is a vigilante, and he goes out and he just kills all criminals because he hates them. Judge Dredd brings criminals to justice because he is the system, he is the law, and he's not going to kill anyone on sight. That is something that the movie often misrepresents. In the movies you get the impression that the death penalty is given for anything. That is not the case in the comics. The death penalty is only given in very, very few instances. But of course there are plenty of people who die while resisting arrest. But if they hadn't resisted, they would have lived, and they would have been free after 20 or 40 or 50 years, whatever, into the future, depending on the nature of their crime and its punishment.
Yeah, you know, I think the Stallone movie got that part wrong, but I got the impression from the newer movie that violence was pretty much the only thing that was met by violence.
No, absolutely. That they had in common was that there was the death penalty for the attempted murder of a judge. That only carries, I think, a 20-year sentence in the comics. Other than that, it's generally resisting arrest that is going to get you killed. Very few things will get you executed on the spot.
So, having never read the comics, I mean, I've read a few of the comics, some of the older, sillier ones. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about why somebody now should read some of the Judge Dredd comics.
Oh, absolutely. Because whatever it is you like about comics, Judge Dredd has it. Because in short, Judge Dredd is a gritty police procedural. It's a comedy, it's a satire, and it's a post-apocalyptic science fiction, all rolled into one neat package. However, it's not necessarily all of these things at the same time. As you said, many of the older comics, they tend to be in-your-face, over-the-top comedic, whereas the more modern comics are more subtle. There's more satire, but not this over-the-top comedy, because the series has evolved over the decades and it has become much more mature as the built-in audience grew up. The comic started in 1972 and then it was a kid series. But they eventually grew up and the themes of the comics did that at the same time. So today, Judge Dredd, for the most part, is a very gritty, hard-boiled crime drama.
I mean, I guess that's like a lot of characters, you know, a lot of characters evolve over time. They've had varying degrees of success with that. I mean, sometimes it's very conflicting and you almost have to abandon the old interpretations completely. So with all that kind of to roll up into one character like Judge Dredd, how do they pull off that level of variety?
Well, the thing that really helps them is the setting. The world of Dredd takes place 122 years into the future, after a nuclear apocalypse has taken out most of the world's population. So most of those who are left live in various megacities scattered around the world. And these megacities are, for the most part, surrounded by wasteland the nature of which depends on where in the world the city is. Generally, it's not wholly unlike what you see in Mad Max. The city of Dredd, Megacity 1, covers the eastern seaboard of the United States, and as we see in the movies, it's generally an alienating concrete jungle. A melting pot with way too many people, way too little resources, and way too few employment possibilities. In this future, the constitution is overthrown, democracy is considered but a failed social experiment of the past, and the world is basically run by fascism. In Megacity 1, it is the Department of Justice that has all power, executed by the judges. But their resources are scattered too thin to actually help and better the situation for the people. So what they do is contain it, maintain the status quo, essentially keep the trouble stirrers down and keep their own power. And this setting allows for any kind of stories under the sun. Everything from over-the-top, in-your-face, surreal comedy, which we saw much of in the past of the series, as well as social satire and hard-boiled crime drama that you have today, with some science fiction and even fantasy scattered in between. Because in this future they have mastered both faster-than-light space travel as well as interdimensional travel, so you have some adventures in that vein too. All of this is within canon. Unlike many similar American comics, there have been no reboots and restarting of the comics and renumbering and all of that. Judge Dredd takes place within the weekly anthology magazine 2000 AD, and it's basically the same canon that has been from day one. And the story is even take place in real time, so 1 year for us equals 1 year in the world of Judge Dredd. So since the onset of the series, there actually has gone 40 years real time. So Judge Dredd has been on the force for more than 50 years, and right now he's more than 70 years old. Of course, he's far more fit than most 70-year-olds of our world, but he does begin to show his age, and he has gone through some level of development.
I had no idea he was so old in the comics now. That's kind of neat, though. I mean, to evolve with the reader, that's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's also not too unlike the Max interpretation of The Punisher by Garth Ennis, where he is also a grizzled 60-year-old man who has aged kind of in real time, who is still a Vietnam vet and has been doing what he does for 40 years since and is starting to show his age. Judge Dredd in the comics is not unlike that. That is actually a pretty good comparison.
What about what's at the core of this character? I mean, I think reviewing, seeing the movies, I think you can kind of have sort of a rough outline of who he is, but I have a feeling the origin story really isn't there in the movie. I don't know if there's even much of an origin for the character in the comics. What would you say to somebody who is just trying to get their head around who is Judge Dredd?
Well, in short, he is the faceless representative of justice. Mind you, though, that this justice is the justice of a police state, of which he is an enforcer. So he is essentially a fascist. From our point of view, he is often the villain as much as he is the hero, because he can easily condemn someone that we sympathize with, who was just in a horrible situation where they had to do some actions that happened to be against the law. He will have no qualms about sentencing such a person to 20 years in jail. If we are to make a Star Wars comparison, Judge Dredd isn't Luke Skywalker. He isn't Han Solo. Even if he has some traits in common with them, he's more like Darth Vader himself, the enforcer of the Empire. However, he has gone through an arc of his own over the course of the decades the series has been out. He started out as kind of a robot, very personality-less, but then he's mellowed, and his opinions have matured over the years, and he can question the system that he represents in a way that he didn't earlier.
One thing that I've been hearing from people who say they're Judge Dredd fans, and I assume they are, for probably about 20 years now, is that the Stallone movie, the 1995 movie, they made the mistake of having the character take his helmet off, which you can't be really surprised about, because when you have a Sylvester Stallone movie, you're giving him that big paycheck. Of course, this movie studio wants to capitalize on his appearance. They want to say, look, here's a movie that has Sylvester Stallone in it, even if showing his face would be kind of a discrepancy from the comics. Is that literally true that he doesn't take his helmet off in the comics?
Yes and no. Many people will say he never takes his helmet off. And this, of course, is untrue. He obviously takes his helmet off. He doesn't shower with his helmet. He doesn't sleep with his helmet, at least not most of the time. But what is true is that the viewer of the comic is never presented to his face. If his helmet is off, which it is at some times, his face is always obstructed from the viewer. We never get to see his face because he is supposed to be the faceless representative of justice. So that is done deliberately. But his helmet, that does come off.
One element of the stories that I've kind of learned, I mean, really, I guess as a fan of any art form, any media form, is you kind of try to get familiar with who actually puts these things together. So with movies, I mean, where people put a lot of attention, especially more than they used to, on who the directors are, even somewhat on who the writers or producers are. But looking at comics, you know, the first question is always who's the writer, and then kind of secondarily, who's the artist? Or, and you know, I guess in some circles it's even kind of flipped. But all that aside, who has worked on Judge Dredd that people looking to get into the comics should kind of look for on the cover?
Well, the thing is that there are many who later became really famous who started out on Dredd or at some point worked on Judge Dredd in the past, such as, for instance, Garth Ennis, Mark Millar, Grant Morrison, and Alan Grant, to name some of the most famous ones. If you see the name Garth Ennis or Mark Millar on the top of a Judge Dredd trade paperback, that is not necessarily a sign of quality. That's the irony, that most of them went on to do better stuff later, which isn't their fault, but they wrote the comics in a time when the editorial team wasn't entirely up to scratch, and the stories suffered for it. The name that you want to look for in a Judge Dredd paperback is primarily John Wagner. He, alongside artist Carlos Esquera, created Judge Dredd and gave the series its direction. And he's been the main writer on and off ever since, although he's mostly retired now. He is the man primarily identified with Judge Dredd, and he is what has made Judge Dredd what it is today, with some good help from Alan Grant. So those are the names you really want to look for: John Wagner and Alan Grant.
We talked a little bit about the movies already. What did you get out of the 1995 movie? I mean, how does that stack up against the comics?
Well, it's a little bit complicated, because if you, at the surface level, it looks very much like the comics do. So visually, it's very much like it, but the spirit isn't there. Because the moment that Stallone signed on, the then in development Judge Dredd movie ceased to be a Judge Dredd movie and instead became a Stallone vehicle, starring Sylvester Stallone as a standard Sylvester Stallone character in a stock Sylvester Stallone movie, dealing with the stock Sylvester Stallone theme, where he essentially is a victim on the run who has to get out of whatever problem he is in, not unlike First Blood and so many other things that he has done. That's kind of the problem, that Dredd himself was portrayed as a victim, because that is something that fits Stallone as an actor, and the whole movie was designed around that. Now, there are many elements from other Judge Dredd storylines in there, but at the core it kind of fails. It fails to capture the spirit of the comics. No matter how many names they check, no matter how many references to stories are in there, no matter how good the visuals may be, the movie fails because it isn't Judge Dredd at the core. And yeah, the helmet came off. but that is not the big problem it's made out to be. I think that people give that a little bit too much importance. The story, of course, should never have been structured so that we had to see his face, but that's still not the big problem. The big problem is that it's a Stallone vehicle more so than the Judge Dredd movie. We also have to keep in mind that the movie was made in 1995, or it was filmed in 1994, but it was released in 1995. And this was the same year as Batman Forever came out. So this is where we were in the comic book to film landscape at the time. X-Men wasn't out yet, Spider-Man wasn't out yet. The thought of actually doing a comic book justice hadn't really occurred to people. So when they got Stallone, it was a Stallone vehicle and everything else was of secondary importance. So even if the director, who was a fan, tried to make the most Dredd that he could, he still had the studio and everything else working against him to make the movie the most blockbuster possible by 1995 standards, which is not necessarily what fans of the comics would want.
So then it sounds like between the two movies, the 2012 version is the one that people are going to enjoy a lot more. What's your take on the 2012 Carl Urban movie?
An excellent movie, whether you see it as an action movie, as a science fiction movie, or as a Judge Dredd adaptation. It is a complete success in all of the above. The 2012 movie captures the spirit of Judge Dredd perfectly. In it, you see who he is. He's basically just an enforcer of the law. He might have some quiet reservations. There is like one point in the movie where Anderson, Cadet Anderson at the time, reads his mind, and she sees anger and determination and something, and then she's cut off. And what the character is about to say is doubt. And that is something which would have been explored in the sequels if there were any. But outwardly, it's business as usual. It's just a day in the life of Dredd. No different from any other. So that one actually captures the spirits of the comics as they are today very nicely. And if you were to have a standalone Dredd movie, I don't see how they could have done it any better. It captures the spirits and the atmosphere of the comics. The only way where it differs slightly is the visuals. The city is much more shantytown, a little bit more, looks more like South Africa, like where they filmed it, a Mad Maxian dystopian ghetto, for lack of better words, which is probably a little bit more realistic given where we seem to be heading. And also they did some slight alterations to the uniform, adding more padding to make it all more grounded and realistic, so there is some slight visual differences, but these again are also true to the spirit of the comic, if not the letter.
One thing that happened after the 2012 movie came out and unfortunately didn't do so well at the box office is fans had a pretty big campaign to try and get the studio's attention and say, we'd really like to see a follow-up to this. So it's my understanding that there was kind of a sequel comic. I don't know, have you read that?
Yes, I've read one of them. There are at least two, maybe even three. We'll have to check that, but there are minimum two. And yeah, they're pretty good, but they're only meant to kind of fill in the gap between the movie that we have seen and the movie which we hopefully, but probably never will see.
So you're not hopeful about seeing that sequel?
No, I wouldn't hold my breath, because even if there is a definite desire and interest among the fans, the problem lies with the distribution. Because you had the production company in the UK, and then you had one distributor in the US, and then you had a whole bunch of smaller national distributors everywhere else. So you're dealing with dozens upon dozens of distributors that all have to agree and sign up for a sequel. And that is just a really complicated situation to navigate. And that's probably going to be the reason why we're not going to get a Judge Dredd sequel. We might get another Judge Dredd movie at some point, but that would be from another production company who would then have to start over. So if we get a sequel to this, nothing is impossible, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
How likely does it look like they're going to do a new one, like with a new company?
Well, that actually depends, because, for instance, the ones who right now own the movie license, the ones who made the previous 2012 movie, DNA, they are the ones who still have the movie rights, and they have been really trying, but they haven't been able to work with all of the other distributors, of all the other international parties that they need to work together with and see eye to eye with to secure the funding. And since they haven't been able to do that, they're probably going to allow the rights to expire back to Rebellion, who owns Judge Dredd outright. Now, in the hypothetical event, now we're talking really hypothetically, but say for instance that Netflix decides that, hey, this movie was pretty good, and it would be awesome if we could do a series like this, but we could capture some viewers like that, and they then pick up the rights from Rebellion, then they can choose to start completely over, or they can choose to rehire all the original contracts and make a sequel of their own. That is theoretically perfectly possible. That would be awesome. So that's like the one hope that remains right now. But a brand new party will pick up the rights and continue where the previous ones left off, which is a long shot. But so, and I wouldn't hold my breath, as I said, but it's not outside the realm of possibility.
If a fan of the movies wanted to start reading the comic, what would you recommend? I mean, there's been so many decades of these comics.
Well, that's difficult with any kind of comic, is where to begin. And there's no obvious solution to that in Judge Dredd, since it's one continuous story. However, you have some places which are pretty good jump-in points, and you also have some trade paperbacks which work very well as an introduction, as well as standalone stories. So what I would recommend is first and foremost the trade paperback America. Many consider this to be the finest Judge Dredd story ever told, and he's only a guest character in it. He's essentially the villain. So there you have Judge Dredd as a fascist enforcer brought to the forefront. Another very different but very intriguing story, one I would mostly recommend to readers of, for instance, The Punisher, would be The Pit. In it, Judge Dredd is assigned to a failing police district, which he has to weed all the corruption out of and bring back to shipshape. So that is a really excellent read, highly recommended. For those who are into origin stories, I recommend Origins, another trade paperback, the one which actually deals with Judge Dredd's origin, something that wasn't revealed to the reader for like 30 years into the comic's history. So his background and origin, you had like some bits and pieces told throughout, but it's only in Origins that it's all revealed. Other than that, you will find that the entire series up to a certain point has been collected in these gigantic phone book paperbacks called case files, and they collect every Judge Dredd story from both the main comic 2000 AD and the side comic Judge Dredd magazine. However, I would not recommend beginning with Volume 1, because many of the earlier stories are not entirely up to par and a little bit weird by modern standings. Again, these are the ones that were written mostly for kids, and they really bring up the satire and the comedy to over-the-top levels. So I would recommend beginning with Case Files Volume 5 and just stick it out from there, because then the series goes into its first major shift. Here we are first introduced to Judge Death, and we are introduced to the Apocalypse War, which really does a number on Megacity 1 and the whole world of Dredd and changes the landscape from there on out. So I'd recommend begin with paperback, so for instance The Pit, to see what you're in for, and then Case Files Volume 5 and onwards.
Well, awesome. I know I'm going to definitely be following up on that, and I hope some of our listeners will too. For more great podcasts, news, and reviews, visit our site at midnightsedge.net and follow us on Twitter at midnightsedge. Also check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/midnightsedge.